Hello and welcome to SchedulesPlus tutorials. Today we're going to take a look at how to create invoices that include an invoice ID. The first thing we're going to want to look at is the templates that you have set up for your site. To do that, you're going to want to go to the templates area, and you can find that under Financials, Invoicing, Templates. And we're going to look at the invoice templates. And in our example, we've got a couple of different templates that have been created. Let's take a look at this one that's called Sample. One of the things that you'll notice in a template is you have this section in tan where you can actually have the system generate a lot of the introductory material that shows up on an invoice. The date of the invoice, the account address, the recipient's address, a salutation, etc. These are things that if you turn these on in this tan area, whenever we generate an invoice through SchedulesPlus, it will show in specific locations and we will put that information in there. And then you see at the bottom part the actual content of the invoice. Now there's other invoices as well, where in this case here we've got a fully customized invoice. And if we take a look at that one, in this case here, we have turned off all of those system-controlled items that get printed on the invoice, and instead we have enabled, and for this particular invoice, the client has created their own template of information. So the client is controlling what's going to show up on that invoice. And in this case here, created a table that had the bill to information with these short codes of mailing name, address, city, state, and zip, the from, which would be the account information, and then a row with the invoice date, the amount due, and the invoice number. And then of course the content of the invoice, the words, etc., the salutation, all show at the bottom of that. So just to again clarify, you can enable our system to put all of the introductory material at the top of the invoice, or you can manage that yourself. If you manage it yourself, as we do here in this one, that's where you're going to ensure that you include that short code for invoice ID. And all these short codes that we've added, we use this drop down to actually insert those short codes. So this one here was the invoice ID that we inserted. And once you save those, your invoice will then, when you generate those through the invoicing tool, will utilize all of these, and it translates the information from the invoice into these specific fields. If I wanted to preview each of these, so let's just take a look now at that fully customized one. The preview of that particular invoice looks as follows. The preview of the system generated header looks as follows. It has a slightly different look to it. So again, system generated versus your own generated, they have different approaches. If it is a system generated invoice, we will place the invoice ID when it's generated appropriately on the page. If you are controlling all of the data on the invoice, then you have to have that invoice ID shortcode. So now let's look at financials, invoicing, and let's just generate an invoice for last month for all of rides. So I use the financial invoicing tab to filter to the set of invoices I want to create. And then of course I want to choose the invoice template that I'm going to use. And here is where now we've introduced a new concept calling to be able to save invoices, to be able to not just save them, but also put an invoice ID and everything. And so that will happen when you include what we call an invoice key when you generate these invoices. So in this case here, I'm going to create a key for this. I'm running this for March 2025, and it's for rides. And I'm going to generate these invoices. And when I choose to generate them either with printing select ones or print all, and I connect this invoice key, what happens then is, you see how now it populates the invoice ID. The invoice ID will always be the person ID for an individual and then a dot sequence. So sequence would be the next number in the series, indicating the number of invoices I've created for this person. And so in this case here, this is the first invoice I've ever generated because it's .1. If it said .2, we would be able to look historically at this person and see that other invoices had been generated. So basically what happens is by including this unique key in the invoice key area, it is telling the system to generate all of those invoices and place the key on each of those invoices. As I scroll through the invoices, you'll see each one of them then has that key. So the key to remember here is if you want to have unique invoice IDs and save the historical invoices you generate, then what you have to do is to make sure that you're generating those invoices and you utilize this key. Now, as a result of having a key, we're keeping track of the invoice history generated. So you can see here under the invoice history tab, I'll be able to see invoices generated and those specific IDs. So I can always at any point in time, I can come to the invoice history and literally view that invoice again to see what was generated using that invoice key that I utilized. The other nice feature about this is that if that person in fact pays and you receive a copy of the invoice or the invoice ID number, you can come back here, view that invoice, and then start the process to log the payment using log payment. And that will open up the payment view for you administratively, where you can choose the items being paid and start the process to actually log that payment. You also have the ability through home use to enable home users to look up their open invoices, select an open invoice, and pay with a credit card, pay the full amount of that invoice with a credit card, and it would just all apply to that particular invoice. So that's a quick view of looking at how to add an invoice ID using this new concept of an invoice key on the invoices that you generate. We do have invoice help that describes all of this on that page as well. And the other nice feature is you can always look up the invoice keys that you've generated. So we always tell you what are the keys that you've used historically. So that's our overview of invoicing with invoice IDs and invoice history. Thank you for joining this tutorial.